What is your moral duty to your romantic partner? Everyone knows the expectations and responsibilities of marriage, but what about other kinds of romantic relationships? Is there really such a thing as a casual relationship or friends with benefits? Do friends with benefits also carry with them certain moral duties? Is sex just like any other activity? Does it matter how you or I individually relate to it, or is there an objective reality to consider? These are the questions we're going to be exploring today.
Love is what you make of it. Loving union, home-cooked meals, strong husband, sweet wife. The grand adventure of love, family, and tradition built to last a lifetime.
Disclaimer. Any relation to real-life characters or situations in this video is purely coincidental, or, in other words, the magic of universal experience. I think a lot of people have been in this situation before where there is an incongruence or an inequality between how the people feel for each other. And a lot of times the person knows that they're more into their partner than their partner is into them, but they hope that sometime in the future they will be able to change this person. And so it's difficult, right? Because a lot of time we get into a relationship or we're getting to know someone and we don't really necessarily know how we feel. But there are lots of times where we do know how we feel. We can know, for example, that this person is just our person for now. All right, so we all have this friend growing up who was basically the master of dating. He crushed it on the dating apps. Every week he was seeing a different girl. It was unlike anything anyone had ever seen before. And so I asked this guy who had been with tons of different girls, and all of them seemed to have a pretty high opinion of him. It didn't really seem like he burned any bridges or made anyone upset. So I asked him, if you're in this situation where you like someone, but they are really into you and they want something long-term with you, don't you feel like you're just sort of wasting their time? Doesn't it feel a bit unfair to them? And he said what his mom always told him was that as long as he's upfront with the girl, he's in the clear. Ultimately, it's the responsibility of each individual to make the choices that best suit them. And in fact, there's something paternalistic about making choices on behalf of other people. And so that sort of resonated with me, that you can't really go through life and all of your relationships basically cutting it off if there's any sort of inequality, because things aren't reciprocal. Maybe you'll even be in a long-term relationship or a marriage or a business relationship where it's not 50-50, but that's okay. But nonetheless, I couldn't help but wonder, even though I'm not morally obligated to break off something that I know doesn't have a future. And in some cases, I even told the person that it doesn't necessarily have a future in my mind, but they insist that we should continue anyway. It still doesn't sit well with me that I'm basically participating in a fantasy that I know will never come true. It doesn't sit well with me that I'm giving hope to a future that isn't going to happen. And I think practically what's happened in a lot of the cases is that I've naturally started to pull away until it gets to the point where the other person cannot tolerate the lack of reciprocity in affection or attention that I'm showing, and they're the ones that have to make the decision to pull away. And I think that's actually a very healthy thing. I think everyone needs to be able to walk away from something that entices them or tempts them in some way, but that ultimately they know isn't good for them. And so it brings me back to what I was telling my friend, which is just because you make a decision for yourself or just because you choose something doesn't necessarily mean that it's good for you. So there's this old debate over friendship we used to have. Is friendship good in itself, or is it good insofar as it involves the bettering of the people involved in the friendship? And so I'll give you an example. The classic movie Thelma and Louise. These are two best friends who basically push each other to do things that are against the law and ultimately hurt a lot of people. And so you could ask the question, well, is this friendship really a good thing? Is it a good thing regardless of what happens, and it's just unfortunate that it results in these bad sorts of things? Or is the friendship in itself actually a bad thing because it enables these qualities and these behaviors in the two friends that are actually a net negative both for themselves and the people around them? And I think it's important to acknowledge that we don't get into these relationships or situationships or whatever it is with clear foresight. It's not that if I were to ask you, do you want to spend the next 6 months in a situationship with someone that you like, but you know that they want a relationship with you and you know that it's not going to happen, and that ultimately you're in this thing and you don't want to hurt them, so you don't break away, but actually you're hurting them more by not breaking away? No, that's not how we make decisions. It's similar to hitting the vape. If I asked you, do you want to vape for the next 6 months? You'd probably say no. But if I ask you, do you want to hit the vape right now? You'd probably say yes. But the reality is that 6 months is comprised of all of these individual yeses compiling over time. And so ultimately, if you put my hand to the flame, I would say that you don't have a moral obligation to the other person to cut off a relationship, because ultimately everyone needs to make their own decisions, and there are plenty of reasons why you can be in a relationship in that moment that isn't going to be your person forever. But I do think you have a moral obligation to yourself to not waste your own time, to not invest in things that you know are fundamentally not good for you, and to acknowledge that there is an opportunity cost to the way you spend your time. So even though you might think that you're in something or in a relationship with someone because it's the best of the situation that you have around you, you don't actually know what your life looks like without that person or with that time spent on other things. So what does this have to do with marriage? Well, the two things that really constitute marriage are permanence and exclusivity. And you often hear the phrase, oh, marriage is a social construct. Yeah, it is a social construct. Now what? There are plenty of social constructs that are helpful for our society. Government, a legal system, all of these things are social constructs. So we have to ask, is it a good construct or is it a bad construct? I'd say the primary function of marriage in a society is the kind of relationship that is most beneficial to raising children. That's not to say that marriage doesn't involve love or companionship or these other things, but the reason why it makes sense for us to promote it as a social construct is that the bonds of exclusivity and permanence are the things that are most conducive to raising a child. Why? Permanence, because you know that their investment in their parents and their parents' investment in each other isn't going anywhere. And exclusivity, because they can trust that the people that they are devoted to are also devoted to each other. And so what makes this different than a friendship is that you can have a lot of different friends. It doesn't detract from one friendship that you have other friendships. But in a marriage, that the actual union of that marriage is an offspring, and you're responsible for that offspring. And that offspring is best raised by its biological wedded parents, then it does make a difference. Now, what I've always been a bit puzzled by is how easily we export these values of marriage and exclusivity from marriage into non or premarital relationships. So it makes sense if you're dating for marriage, but a lot of us start dating in high school, and you wouldn't say for the most part that you're dating for marriage, but nonetheless, there is the expectation of exclusivity and permanence. And in these cases, if the relationship really is based on companionship, or recreation, or even love, why are those things necessary? I think a reasonable answer is that it is out of fear that you're going to lose this person, or that you don't want to share this person with somebody else. But that doesn't really apply to other family members or other friends. There seems to be something unique about a sexual relationship that demands exclusivity. And I think a good candidate for a reason to why that is that physiologically women are wired to invest in and commit to their sexual partner, because practically what happens a lot of time is that if they become pregnant, they need that exclusive and permanent investment from the partner in order to raise that child and also to provide for them during their times of vulnerability throughout the pregnancy. So it makes sense why a lot of the time, the first time that a couple has sex, the woman might seem to be a lot more invested, and conversely, the man might seem to be less interested. In some sense, he has won the negotiation. They say that a woman is the gatekeeper of sex, but the man is the gatekeeper of commitment. And so too often, we basically see the women in our society, in an effort to seduce or keep the man, actually give up their primary bargaining chip, which is the sexual intimacy, very early on, and actually lose that leverage and ability to command and develop the commitment and investment from the man. Then we ask, after how many dates is it appropriate to have sex? And then they'll come up with these rules. But in reality, the right answer is at the moment at which you think the man is fully committed to you, if that's what you're interested in, if that's what you're looking for. And so if it's the case that someone's just gonna bolt because you don't put out early on, then that's definitely not the person you should be with. And it goes back to my earlier point that you need to be willing to walk away. And it's the same thing with guys. A lot of time why you would end up in a sexual relationship with a girl that you know that you're not going to spend the rest of your life with is because of scarcity, is because a lack of availability of other options, a feeling that perhaps, this is the best you're going to get during this time period or this part of your life. And so just like the vape, or just like all sorts of other things, that are attractive but detrimental, that you keep hitting it. In this case is that you're not just affecting yourself. You're dealing with another person who can develop real feelings for you. And so even though in any of these cases, it takes two to tango, the woman is responsible for her own behavior and making sure that she's making the best decisions for herself, you're really doing a disservice to yourself by continuing in that relationship. Ultimately, you don't want to feel like you are not being true to yourself and your values. And ultimately, you don't want to feel like you're benefiting at the expense of somebody else. Now, for the most part, I've been talking about this sort of dynamic where the guy is less invested than the girl. And that's not always the case. I mean, you can have it the other way around. But from my limited empirical experience, I tend to see that it is the girl who is more often in the position of being more into the guy than the guy is into the girl. And it's very possible that it's because a lot of the relationships start with this physical intimacy so early on. Unfortunately, what the physical intimacy does is actually stunt the development of the relationship in other ways. So you can imagine if you're in a relationship and each time there's a pause or silence or an awkward moment, and you sort of just have to sit with it, just like you would with a friend or a colleague or whatever else it is, you're going to see pretty early on whether this is someone that you can spend a lot of time with. But if physical intimacy is an option so early on, there's a good chance that you're going to end up hampering the development of that relationship, because you can just basically get together, cuddle, watch TV, fuck, and there doesn't really need to be that much interaction. And I think a good litmus test of this is if you actually go out, for an hour, 2 hour, if you go out for regular dates with this other person, does that feel like a good use of your time? Are you genuinely enjoying that? So then what's the solution if we're sort of living in this paradigm of, you have marriage on the one hand, and then you have these relationships that aren't necessarily for marriage on the other? How do we sort of deal with this? And my inclination is to be single until you're dating for marriage, and that the things in between are not good for either party. Because if you have a relationship that isn't geared toward marriage but demands this exclusivity and or permanence, or at least this indefinite commitment, then you're really just accepting the liability and the limitations of the exclusive relationship without the upside, which is constructing the kind of relationship that is ideal for raising a child and building a home and a family. Like I said earlier, I think the reason why people try to import these ideas of exclusivity and permanence into premarital relationships is that they want to lock this person down. But if the relationship isn't to get locked down, it really is just to have a good time, then have a good time until you don't have a good time anymore. It doesn't make sense to lock yourself into a contract that you're going to have to pay a heavy price to get out of, and is going to cost a lot to both parties. And really the last thing you want to do is be in a relationship that prevents you from both pursuing the things that you can pursue as a single person, as well as preventing you from finding the person that you do want to marry. I would love to hear your guys' thoughts on this, your experiences with it. It's something that I've thought a lot about. I've had my experiences. I've read religion, philosophy. I've talked to other people about their experiences. I've seen the kind of differences in trends of culture and what people say about it. Let me know, are there situations where it makes sense to be in a relationship that you think has no future? If so, what are the sort of moral duties that you owe to the other person? If you're in one of these situationships and you are the party that feels less invested, do you have a moral obligation to cut it off with the other person? Do you have a moral duty to yourself? Or maybe there's no morals to this at all. Maybe that's just a practical calculus. Let me know in the comments. Let me know if you want me to talk about anything else, and I'll see you next time. Thanks a lot.
Well, folks, that's the lowdown on these here casual affairs. Remember, life's a dance, and sometimes you just want a partner for a quick spin around the floor.